Hello, today we're going to be talking about paper 3 in the context of the previous paper 1 and 2 for the 2024 exams. From the 2024 paper 1 and 2, we can see what has been tested and therefore what's more likely to come up in these sets of exams. So the first thing that certainly comes up is the fact that development hasn't been tested in paper 2 and therefore is very likely. Let's look back at the previous exams over the last few years and look at what hasn't been tested and therefore what's more likely to come up. So, measures of growth and development, again, last tested in 2017, so really important that you get your head around all of those different types of measures. And we'll talk about the use of GDP to measure economic growth as well. That hasn't come up either, so I think that this is possibly more likely, perhaps as a 5-marker. Harrod-Domar, again, never tested. The economic growth rate being savings ratio over the capital output ratio. Now, I mention this because this is often misunderstood. We want your savings ratio to be high, so that consumers are saving a high proportion of their income going into banks and coming out as investment with lots of new capital and growth. But we also want, and the difficult bit is the low capital output ratio, where each unit of output requires a small amount of capital. When you put it the other way, 1 unit of capital produces much more output. That shows you that you have a high level of productivity. And so therefore, your economic growth, it makes sense, doesn't it? You need plenty of investment, but you also need that investment to be going into things which are productive as well. Absence of property rights has never been tested. Very simply, if you don't own property, then you're not able to borrow and then invest because you don't have something called collateral. The bank doesn't have any safeguard to ensure that if you don't pay back your loan, they can take an asset from you. Assets also generate wealth, and if ownership is unclear, then it can't do that because those assets may not well go up in price because they're not that valuable because we don't know who owns them. And environmental destruction, if you don't own, if environmental assets such as rivers or forests aren't owned, then it probably will result in the tragedy of the commons, and therefore you're likely to see the abuse or the pollution of these scarce resources. Joint ventures is a great evaluation of FDI. One of the problems of FDI is that you have transnational firms coming to invest in your country, but they may not transfer their technology and their skills, and they may simply extract resources. If you're able to sign a contract with that firm to ensure that they work with your local firms, that may transfer those technology and skills to your local firm. The only way you're going to do that, though, is if you can actually force the company to do that. And why would they actually agree to that if they are free to go to another country which doesn't require them to do that? And so China's a good example here. It is different. It has a bigger local market, and so you can force companies such as VW to work with your local firms, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't be able to access that huge local market. Buffer stock schemes, again, never tested, directly relevant to development. Often, this is somewhat difficult to understand, but actually it's pretty simple. In a good year, the harvest for your country, the supply of whatever it is, cocoa, for example, may go to the right. You have a perfectly inelastic supply because that's what you have after your harvest. You can see here that the price in that sense will go below the price floor, and therefore the government will need to buy up X to Y amount of that cocoa. It puts it into storage, but by doing that, it's going to make the price go back up again from Y back up to that floor price. It keeps the cocoa, and then in the bad year, next year, for example, when the supply goes to the left, it will then sell off A to B of cocoa from its stores. The price originally wanted to go up above the ceiling price. That selling of extra stocks increases the supply to the market and pushes us back to B, where we have the ceiling price met. The idea behind all of this is that you start to see more investment in the industry. You start to see cocoa farmers being able to plant more trees and so on, and therefore the volatility disappears. You could link this to government failure. As you could with managed exchange rates as well, you're going to have high administration costs. You're going to have distorting of price signals, really important ideas which you could bring in, and therefore not leading to the development that we wanted. Managed exchange rates, not particularly, I don't think this has ever been tested. If you have fewer fluctuations of your exchange rate, just like in the buffer stock scheme, it's actually the same thing. You'll see they're putting a ceiling and floor price on your exchange rate, and you're buying up and selling foreign exchange reserves. That might result in more stability in investment, but the need to defend the managed exchange rate is difficult through interest rates and through your foreign exchange reserves. And often it doesn't solve the cause of the problem, which is probably primary product dependency. And therefore, both of these issues, solutions don't seem to actually cause the diversification that we need in order to get away from the volatility that we see. Development of primary industries. You've got some good examples of Chile with copper and Mexico with avocados. The Lewis model tells us that we should move from primary products to manufacturing, moving our farmers from unproductive, less productive industries into factories, which are more productive. But it might well be that we could actually focus on those primary industries if those industries are income elastic. And thus, as world income rises, the percentage increase in demand for avocados and copper, for example, is greater, and therefore the prices of these goods will be high, and my exports will be rising significantly as well, resulting in growth and hopefully development. Tourism, I think this actually has been tested now I think about it, but for example in Sri Lanka, you just need to link it to exports, and you get foreign currency, and that allows more imports as well, possibly diversification. You might get education and skill transfer, and labour-intensive industries like hotels will create lots of employment. But we saw with Sri Lanka and Egypt and such countries, if you are over-reliant, then that might result in large recessions and depressions, and it could cause environmental destruction. Now, my gamble, if I were to gamble on this one, would be privatization. We haven't seen this tested before, and it is really quite a nice topic maybe for a 12 marker, for example, or even a 25, the micro and macro effects of privatization. We're going to take some state-owned enterprises, for example, Vietnam's telecom industry, and we're going to put it into private hands. The competition will drive innovation and investment because you have to get better. That could shift your variable cost curves down. It would shift aggregate demand to the right because of the investment, and LRES to the right because of the specialization, possibly the innovation as well, and the fact that capital is a factor of production. And those IPOs, when the initial public offerings, also give room for cash injections and more innovation and investment. But we don't know what the market's going to be. Is it contestable? Are you going to get higher prices? Are you going to get monopoly power? Or are you going to get a competitive industry? We don't really know that. Possibly other interventions are needed to make it competitive. The World Bank, again, never tested. NGOs as well. You just need to know about these reconstruction loans and development loans and the promotion of economic reforms. NGOs think charities, independent of government, and have different social or other goals. Now, we know that these haven't been tested before, limitations of using GDP, so that could be a good call. The fact that GDP doesn't measure informal economies, environmental destruction, inequality or purchasing power, this seems directly relevant to development as well, and the fact that we need better measures. So that could be, for example, a 5-mark question, which could be on that data response. Unemployment, again, we've had significant labour inactivity, so effects of those through less skills as you stay unemployed, lower tax revenue for the government, benefits and inequality, all possible ideas coming up there. Impact of economic change and development on inequality. Well, that's an interesting one, and we could use a number of ideas to talk about that. We could talk about the Lewis model, moving those farmers to factories. You create urban-rural inequality as a result. You could talk about structural unemployment through geographic immobility. We can't move those people to the right places. We could talk about the creation of wealth through globalization and bigger firms and privatized firms. That creates huge wealth for a very small part of the population. And we could talk about the role of the government in the fact that we have increasing inequality at the first part of our development process, but as we have the government intervening more, taking more tax and rediverting it to useful projects such as infrastructure, health and education, then that might actually be the opposite as well. Absolute relative poverty, not tested for a while. Patterns of trade, terms of trade, trading blocks, all these things are very easy to mix up. So please do make sure that you've revised the difference between them. Trading blocks specifically, it's difficult to actually realize that trading blocks are a two-way agreement. I agree to drop my tariffs on you, but you agree to drop your tariffs on me. And if you wanted to show that in a diagram, if you want to show the effect on, let's say, for example, a coffee producing nation, say Ethiopia, for example, then you're going to need to show the Eurozone as a domestic market. The Eurozone drops its tariffs on Ethiopia, and Eurozone imports of coffee are going to rise such as that. That shows you the exports and therefore the AD and therefore possibly LRAS as well from reinvestment for the developing country you're talking about. And the evaluation of that can be that, well, the developing country then has to drop their tariffs back on the Eurozone, which is going to possibly flood with lots of cheap imports. Role of the WTO, again, very important, hasn't been tested, reducing trade barriers, judging trade disputes, and the role that that might have with trading blocks causing conflict. As trading blocks, they reduce tariffs between a club of countries, but they might result in protectionist policies between those trading blocks as well, and that might go against the WTO's role of dropping tariffs globally. Factors affecting floating exchange rates. Well, interest rates are very current at the moment, so that could be something to think about. The fact that interest rates affect savings in your country and might draw in hot money flows into local banks. And again, the government intervention in exchange rate markets, again, interest rates might be something to think about there as a way in which you could achieve that. Comparative advantage hasn't been calculated. We haven't seen calculations for quite a long time. So just making sure that if you are doing a comparative advantage diagram, you don't have them crossing over, because that would show absolute advantage, although in previous times they have accepted that as well. It's quite nice on this diagram to show specialization, and we can say that for the UK it's going to move this way into financial services. China is going to move this way to steel, and so you can get from that a changing structure of your economy. You can get a specialization and possibly structural unemployment. You can possibly get also the idea of inequality as well, while showing huge amounts of growth and efficiency as well. Some other ideas: negative externalities of production, possibly relevant to development as well in developing countries, hitting the well-being of local people. Public goods, that's a possibility, as public goods have a role in development. For example, infrastructure, it might be considered to be non-rival and non-excludable, and if it is, then it may not be built, and therefore it may be more difficult for firms to expand. That goes back to a point here: constraints on business growth. That's possible too. Why can't firms in developing countries expand, and all of these issues that they have here? Government failure, not directly tested so far really. So again, the fact that this could result from development issues like price signals, subsidies and buffer stock schemes, as we talked about before, unintended consequences like smuggling, excessive administration costs, and possibly coming through corruption there as well. So lots and lots of ideas there. I had an idea that possibly perfect competition could be linked to development, and the fact that firms in commodity markets might be making normal profits and have price volatility. So you could maybe evaluate that as well. And finally, monopsony, large firms large international firms may be buying up local commodities like cocoa and therefore lowering the price for agricultural exporters as well. There are a few examples. I hope that they're useful, and good luck for the paper.